state government or the central government doesn't really matter. It's a separate tax, and the 2% is 2% at the national level, will apply uniformly regardless of which city gets the money from the allocation fund. So it can be just a supplementary 2% national tax without having to track it to individual level. So those are the options. The last point I want to say in the context of GST is the treatment of land and property. In the GST design, even to this date, there is no agreement whether land, buildings, and the real property will be subject to GST. As of now, both the center and the states have accepted the view that the GST will only apply to all supplies of goods and services other than real property. Now, that's a very serious issue, and it's largely political. And the political view is that, well, one view is that there are 3 items in India: land, liquor, and learning. And there's a lot of rent seeking in these 3 sectors, and the states don't want to give up that deep pocket. And if the GST is levied, then the center will also participate in collection of revenues from these 3 sectors. So liquor is being proposed to be kept outside. Land is being proposed to be kept outside. And the learning, even though it's inside the GST, but most likely they will exempt educational institutions under GST, so they'll be outside. Under most of the GST models in the modern world, land is treated no differently than any other product. So if you buy a house, the full purchase price of the house is subject to VAT or GST. No exceptions whatsoever. You don't ask the question about movable or immovable. In Canada, we used to have a slogan that we tax everything that moves. If it doesn't move, we tax it until it moves. So now China is an interesting example. In most of the jurisdictions like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Singapore, Japan, Canada, tax stops on the residential properties after the first sale of a new house. So the resale of a home is not taxable. Commercial buildings are taxable fully, no matter resale, sale, resale, everything is taxable. But homes, you only pay tax once when you buy the new home. After that, there's no further tax. In China, tax applies, and that's the only country in the world they have a business tax, and the business tax applies not only on the first sale of a new home, but also the resale. So any increase in the value of a residential home gives rise to the tax base, which can be taxed. Now, if I follow Roy's logic that there are a lot of rents accruing to the homeowners because of urban development, infrastructure development, they will lead to a higher price of residential properties. Why not tax it? And China is taxing it, and there's been a lot of debate whether that feature should be continued under GST, because China is also moving from business tax to VAT, and now they're integrating the tax on construction and housing into the VAT design. So that's a debate they are having. In India, I really hope that some serious discussion is given for inclusion of real property into the base for the GST. And this alone can make enough room to create a supplementary tax base which can be utilized to fund the municipalities. For example, without land and real property in the GST system, suppose the revenue neutral rate for the center is 5%. If you include land and real property in the base, that rate can easily drop to 3.5 to 4. But you can still keep the rate at 5 and use the supplementary now 1% revenue to fund the municipalities and the local bodies. So those are the issues. I hope that people will take note of, and in their further research, uh, perhaps give more consideration how to integrate those options coming out of this conference into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poddar, for the deep insights into the system of taxation at the local level and how it relates to the taxation at state and center. We have about 12 minutes left. Can we extend by a few minutes? Yeah. So depending on the number and nature of questions, we can extend it to about 15 minutes. So may I request the floor? Yes. How should we do? Do you have a mic? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Rathin.
Yeah, thank you. This was a very, very, I think, fascinating session. Absolutely. I don't think I've learned more in an hour in the last, since I was in university, probably. Okay. Professor Bahl, I mean, well, it's nice that a doyen of public finance like you sort of agrees with me about the functional, the lexicography of how you deal with these things, and governance must come first. In that context, I had an analytical question. So when you speak of governance and jurisdictional governance, and I'm thinking of India versus China, so this is pertinent in that case, does it matter whether we apply political economy, median voter, T-boot oat style theory in deciding how, taxpayers or beneficiaries will respond to different jurisdictional demands placed upon them? Or is it simply a matter of deciding the jurisdictions? In other words, you need to have democratic accountability to a political executive, so that then the way people respond is, like Professor T-Boot says, they vote governments out or they vote with their feet, either, they vote governments out. The other way you'd respond is price resistance, and the usual ways you respond in markets, where you don't have the second option of actually changing the people who take decisions about you. That's my question to you. To Mr. Poddar, if I may have a small question, which is worrying me. This is very interesting, and of course it's interesting when Abhay said in the morning that the Finance Commission spoke to the urban local bodies. What you have revealed is they spoke not because they wanted to, of course I'm sure they did, but because in a sense they had to, because the big deal in that Finance Commission was the GST, and since that was going to be subsumed, something had to be done to compensate the local bodies. But in that discussion, what came up was this, that the issue of GST involves local governments because you're taking away tax assignments that are specifically assigned to them because you're saying they're inefficient. Octroi, entertainment, fine. And therefore they need to be compensated. But that compensation does not have to be tied to the tax that is now being levied, the GST, which continues to be a matter for political negotiation between the center and the states. That compensation can happen by giving them money from the divisible pool, right? So that takes away equally from the center and the states. Now that, in my view, is not a tax assignment or reassignment. That's simply another form, in effect, right, analytically, of devolution from a divisible pool. There is no taxing power being transferred, because then the GST, what the GST is, what it will be levied on or not levied on, everything is decided by state finance minister and the central government. The local bodies are told, don't worry about it, not your game, you'll get your money, shut up. That's not the spirit by which we want, surely, local bodies to be empowered through taxes. So I'd like, am I wrong, or what are your views on this?
So that's a pretty good question about the consumer voter selection. I guess in the case of China, the answer would have to be there's, of course, no voice vote. So it would have to be voting with your feet to make the prophecy come true. And I think that would depend on the extent to which the metropolitan area residents were mobile. And I guess we'd answer they probably are not. So in the case of China, that sort of thinking would begin to come apart. Now, India, I don't know. I mean, you're in a better position than I am to to answer that. But I would guess that the same. I, I don't know. I guess residents would be more mobile than in China, but I don't know how mobile labor is in India within metropolitan areas. But there would be a voice vote, wouldn't there? I mean, in India within metropolitan areas.
If you had elected metropolitan areas to which
Yeah.
families are, but accountable, yes, at the moment, certainly.
Mm-hmm. So it's a good question. I think in China it's clear that the accountability's up. In the case of India, maybe you tell me.
There was a question to Mr. Poddar. Rathin, second question.
Can you sort of clarify again your question?
No, you're saying that basically, okay, very simply, in technical terms, when you're saying that, okay, we have a GST and then we earmark part of it for the third tier, that's the same as grace and favor devolution, because the third tier then is not part of the conversation on what the tax should be, what it should be levied on. So basically, what you're doing is compensating them, right?
But the question will be, how do you allocate that revenue to individual governments at the local and municipal level? Now, suppose you try to allocate basis of consumption, if you can measure it somehow, or the population. Now, a divisible pool which consists of all revenues will not be based on any local characteristics of the base. But if you are identifying a specific tax, a GST, you can try to find a proxy for consumption in that municipality.
Got it. Thanks.
Thanks. Barjor?
Roy, I have a question. I was very intrigued by this statement of this commandment, one of the 10 commandments that you put forward. Make the grant system asymmetric. Now, from other experiences, not in India, but where we've been working on, intergovernmental transfers, grants to all local governments without making a distinction between urban and rural, where we were forced into a situation of making them symmetric. And then we made the case in those countries, again, not in India, that the cities, not the rural areas, but the cities required special attention because what came down to roughly a $2 per capita per annum grant, which went across the board to rural and urban, didn't make any difference or couldn't achieve anything in the cities. So therefore, there was a case for the cities having a separate grant mechanism. Now, in India, if you were to take a situation such as the JNURM and turn it into an intergovernmental grant system, by which a formula takes in from the center and uses a formula to distribute it, would there be a case to have an asymmetry in saying that where you invest more or the grant is more in favor of those cities where there is a likelihood of getting more bang for the buck? So for instance, in India, the second tier of cities, not the metros, not the small ones, but in the middle. So is that where you were getting at when you meant the asymmetric grant?
That's also interesting. That isn't exactly where I was going with it. Where I was going with it was basically that metropolitan areas are simply different than the rest of the country, and where you might have a little bit of a fancier kind of allocation system for metropolitan areas, that you'd want something simpler for the smaller governments, and that you would just have a different kind of a system. But the sort of thing you're suggesting, actually we have that around the world, don't we? If you think of matching grants require a buy-in, and you basically are creating an asymmetrical system that would encourage the richer local governments to buy in. And so I guess if you think about it, we have lots of different kinds of grants that are structured exactly that way.